How's it going, everyone? And welcome to episode 5. Can you believe it? Episode 5 of the Gulf War. Tonight's episode is going to be focused on the topic, very exciting topic, of sports washing. Yes, something everybody wants to discuss. Sports washing, it's honestly played a pretty big role in this LIV versus PGA dispute. I mean, people aren't going to want to admit this, but it has honestly been one of the main sticking points and cudgels used against LIV. If you just think about it, LIV obviously has a lot of things going for it, but it also has a lot of things against it. But I think the main thing is this idea of sports washing. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, we're going to explain it a little bit deeper. But essentially, sports washing is related to soft power. And I'll give the exact definition, which is the use of sports to improve reputation tarnished by wrongdoing. I mentioned the term soft power, and that really means, if you think about it in terms of hard power and soft power is using tools that are less direct, more indirect tools that are used by countries in their foreign policy. Hard power is more like tariffs, sanctions, dropping a bomb. That's more hard power. Soft power is trying to change people's perceptions through, talking with them, dialogue, these sorts of things. So the allegation against LIV is that LIV is essentially being used by the Saudi government to sports wash all of the wrongdoing that it's done. And I do want to get into this and give it a fair shake because I think it's a very, very important issue. But just to give you a little bit of background on what we consider sports washing, but more generally sports and diplomacy, this concept actually goes all the way back to the ancient Olympics, the very first Olympiad in ancient Greece. And it was really used as a form for countries to have a dialogue where they otherwise really wouldn't have one. This idea of the Olympic truce, this represents the idea that during these first Olympic Games, countries that were at war would stop fighting with each other and would participate in these games. All the athletes could have safe passage. That's where this kind of idea of sports and diplomacy interlocking goes back. And, as we see it kind of evolve moving forward, this sort of idea of sports diplomacy, which has actually been really heavily studied in academic literature, is actually pretty apparent in a lot of different examples today. You could look at things like different countries hosting the World Cup or the Olympics. That they're trying to show something about themselves. They're trying to portray a message about their country. That's the whole reason they bid so much money to host these games and ultimately wind up in debt. So you could look at, Russia or China hosting the Olympics in recent years, or Qatar hosting the World Cup in soccer in the last couple of years. All these controversial things, but ultimately the reason these host countries wanted to do it is because they're trying to portray an image of themselves that they want the world to see. And that is essentially the argument, is that's what the Saudi Arabian government is doing with LIV Golf. Its detractors say that Saudi Arabia is essentially trying to buy, goodwill among global citizens and is trying to give itself a better reputation through its sponsorship of LIV. And to certain degrees, I think this is a very fair claim and honestly is just true. I mean, if you're the Saudi government, of course you're trying to do this. You understand that people have concerns about you and your record, and so you're trying to prove that, you're not all the bad things that people say you are. At the same time, though, we do have to ask the question, what are they trying to redirect the conversation from? And, just in case you're not familiar with some of the kind of pretty disgusting issues and human rights violations that have gone on in Saudi Arabia, just to list a couple that have been of specific interest to detractors of LIV, have been the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, this is someone that, was just doing his job and would occasionally put out a story that was critical of the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, and for that he was murdered by agents of the Saudi Arabian government, and U.S. intelligence as well as the UN have directly tied his murder to the Saudi crown prince. MBS. And so this is, we have our own government and, the world's governmental body saying that this man's murder, this journalist's murder, is at the hands of the Saudi government and the leader of Saudi Arabia itself. I mean, that's a pretty shocking allegation, and by all means, it appears to be true. And this was several years ago now, but, it's still something that's pretty apparent in a lot of people's thinking. But obviously also, there are concerns about Saudi Arabia's connection to 9/11. And I'm not going to get into the specifics too much, but we do know that a recently revealed FBI report showed that there are more connections between Saudi Arabia and the terrorist attacks than previously known. This has been made public in recent years. I still think there's probably not a lot of people that have actually heard about this, interestingly enough. But this information is all public. We'll put it on the website. You can, do some research for yourself and see what you think. But these are all things that are being used against Saudi Arabia and hence LIV Golf. Interestingly, and I think I've mentioned this before, the PGA Tour has also used this as, ammunition for themselves. And one mistake, in hindsight, clearly a mistake they've made, was enlisting the help of the 9/11 families to speak out against LIV Golf. Now, these families have every right to have concerns about Saudi Arabia, given what I just told you about their connections to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, allegedly. But essentially, the tour used these families to say that, to criticize American golfers and essentially the public for, getting on board with LIV Golf. They're trying to remind them of the past. And, at the time it was a fair point for the tour to make. But we go through time, a little bit of time passes, and then we have the potential merger that I talked about in the last episode with the PGA Tour and LIV. Obviously, it still hasn't happened yet. Well, the question becomes to the tour, if Saudi Arabia and LIV Golf is guilty of sports washing and they have these connections to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, then why are you now getting into business with these people? I think that is a very fair question to ask the tour, and they essentially have egg on their face because they know that what they were doing was completely hypocritical. It was a PR disaster for the tour. And, I mean, that's just not me saying that. That's been pretty widely reported. ProPublica had a really good piece on this about how the 9/11 families turned on the tour, so they were really hurt about how they were essentially used by the tour and that it was all a PR stunt. They really didn't care about it. So this does just go to show that, if you're going to use the sports washing allegation, you probably shouldn't then go into the business with the people you're accusing of doing that in the first place. So that's just a lesson for the tour. But in general, I do think that this argument of sports washing is definitely something to pay attention to because it has been one of the central allegations against LIV from its founding. I don't think it's going anywhere. Obviously, a lot of talk has been had about this, and maybe at some point it's all been talked out. I don't know, but it's something that everybody is aware of. And if you just walk up to someone on the street and ask them about this, there's a good chance it's going to get brought up. So I think this was a good topic to look into a little bit because maybe not everyone is familiar with sports washing, but they definitely should be and should be wary of its usage because it's essentially trying to manipulate public opinion to curry favor with some of these groups or countries that we have historically viewed as kind of having pretty poor human rights records or, records in other departments. And so I do think it's fair to look into these allegations. And, this is something that LIV Golf, if you want to say LIV is an arm of the Saudi government, then you can definitely make the argument that it is being used to sports wash the the country. And it's not necessarily something you can fault them for, because of course they want more businesses to invest there. They want people to come travel there. But if your country isn't able to show that it holds itself to certain standards that we would expect, whether it's on human rights, on gay rights, on all these sorts of different things, then it's kind of hard to forge these close connections. Now, obviously, over time, we would hope to see these things start to go away a little bit. We'd start to see some progress, and that's definitely happening in Saudi Arabia. I mean, there are so many examples of that in recent years. But we also need to be honest about what the past is telling us, because if we just ignore the lessons of the past, then the future is probably not going to be that surprising to us if we just look at the past. So, sports washing, sure, it's not it's not something that people really want to get excited about, but it is a very important tool that is used in this example, this case study, but also in diplomacy in general. And I do think it's definitely something to consider when looking at the LIV-PGA dispute. In our next and final episode, I think this is going to be one of my favorite episodes. We're going to be looking into some of the geopolitical tensions that are emerging from this dispute. Anyone who knows me knows that I really can't talk about anything without bringing this up. So I do think this is going to be an exciting episode to look into all these different dimensions and see how politics is affecting the LIV-PGA dispute in more ways than you could probably imagine. This is going to be a really fascinating episode. So I hope you tune in to our final episode. That'll be coming up soon. So thank you for listening again. This has been episode 5 of the Gulf War, titled Sports Washing.